kind of always been bothered by the fact that the world of national security and foreign policy is just totally alien to everyone I grew up with, and like I would go home on leave and I would try to have conversations with people about foreign policy, and I would just find it really hard to explain why any of the shit that we did mattered, or like 99% of the stuff that we did, I guess. And like, if you value democracy, if you want the state to serve the interests of the people, of the common good, then you have to explain your value proposition. Like, what would you say you do here? And so I tried to do that many times, and I could barely persuade myself, let alone them, and so that's always kind of rubbed me wrong in the back of my head or my soul or something. But how does that end up making me like a foreign policy dissident, basically? And that was a process. It was gradual. There were a series of moments that were moments of reflection or inflection points or something like that. But it wasn't like any one thing necessarily. It just started seeming more and more obvious that Washington foreign policy was just built on a series of, I'm just going to be like totally honest in this conversation. Okay, so it is what it is. Like, Washington foreign policy is just built on lies, right? At best, cherry-picked facts. We believe things in Washington. We tell ourselves stories about our role in the world that are just not true. They're just not. Like, to believe it, you have to ignore like a ton of evidence to the contrary, right? And that's problematic, right? There's something about being close to power that distorts your ability to see the world as it really is, and especially to see who has to eat it because of the choices that you make with power. And when you're blind to the costs that others absorb because of what you do with your power, that comes back to you, right? There's many metaphors and concepts to explain that, the boomerang effect and all of that, but like blowback. But the idea that like you have a blind spot in terms of like who you make sacrifice on your behalf is the beginning of your end. That's how you demise. That's how empires die, right? And so by 2016, it was clear to me that U.S. foreign policy was not making the world better, and it wasn't benefiting most Americans. And yet everyone in Washington was telling me the opposite. When I had opportunities to write op-eds or like research articles of some kind, I was basically being asked to say the opposite of what I was feeling and recognizing. And that tension sat uneasily with me. And so like, and then I learned in the think tank world, this is no shade to Andrew, but like I had learned in the think tank world that, the whole thing is very corrupt, not necessarily in a breaking laws way, although that happens, but in a like, this is not how the system should work sort of way. And I found that problematic as well. I didn't like the groupthink tendencies of the foreign policy elites in Washington, the idea policing of everybody inside the Beltway, where it's like you're all checking on each other to make sure that everyone's doing correct think, like you don't get invited to the panels if you think the wrong way, all this stuff. I wanted to get at. Basically, like by the time we were in the end of the Obama years, I was like desperate to get out of foreign policy. I was so desperate to get out of DC that I actually started a protein bar business. And I was selling I found a factory to make protein bars, and I was selling them into grocery stores for real. This was a side hustle. I almost didn't finish the PhD because I was doing this on the side. And it was like, I was that fed up with the national security world in the Obama years, right? So I was trying to get out. And part of me knew that if I didn't get out, I would never be able to like stand on my own intellectually. Like, what do I even believe? Well, I'm never going to find out if I stay in this swamp, you know? So getting out was like a condition of possibility for critical reflection, fewer panels, fewer conferences and all that, fewer interactions with the media. And then like in the North Korean nuclear crisis in 2018, that was sort of where I gained public prominence, kind of narrating the crisis and warning how things could go wrong. And I did my best to exploit that opportunity. But there was a moment in that crisis where like Trump and Kim Jong-un were threatening fire and fury with each other. And one of Kim Jong-un's generals threatened to bracket fire Guam, like to fire medium range ballistic missiles to envelope either side of Guam. And in that moment, I like had this flood of, I don't know, consciousness about things that I knew, but like had not thought about in daily life, that Guam was a present day colony of the US specifically. And that's why it hosts a nuclear bomber base and no other place does in the Pacific, right? And Guam is target number one of not just North Korea, but China. And Guam's people have no say in that, And so they're denied self-determination, but they're also denied their own, the control of their own fate, And so like we use their subordinated status to play military games, and we use them as a kind of shield, and we redirect the risks of our military strategies toward them. And we don't give them any ability to like decide for themselves about this stuff, And so that in that moment where it's like, there's a possibility Kim Jong-un could light up Guam, the Chamorro, the people of Guam have no say in this shit. And that ain't right. Like I grew up in the church, but I'm not religious, but it's like, what would Jesus do? Would he light up Guam? No. Would he redirect insecurity toward Guam? No. He's 10 toes for the poor, right? So like, how are you going to treat your fellow human beings this way? Unacceptable. So that wasn't like a singular radicalizing moment necessarily, but it made me more and more committed to thinking about foreign policy from the standpoint of its victims, basically. And in the national security world, one of these victims is the American working class itself. And like nobody was talking about that. The analysis in the Washington world had nothing to do with the working class. And that got back to my roots, my beginnings of like, that's where I came from. That frustration I've always felt when I would go home and try to talk to people about foreign policy, and it felt like Mars and Venus, like they just didn't connect up. That was because the working class does not exist. The majority of folks in democracy do not exist in the minds of people doing foreign policy, and that's a problem. So I can't remember what the question was at this point, but I've been just ranting for a while, so I should probably stop.
At the beginning of the Biden administration, he talked quite a bit about foreign policy for the middle class, and that disappeared after about a year. Do you think that was some of the fruits of that conversation of trying to talk about inequality, generating a foreign policy that makes sense for most Americans?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, that was like a pretty failed project. Like the middle class did not really feature in Biden's foreign policy at all. It was more like a rhetorical gesture. But that came initially from Jake Sullivan when he was working at the Carnegie Endowment. And it was all about like trying to triangulate across a couple different things. One is that you had to have an affirmative agenda for foreign policy that differentiated the Democrats from Trump, right? So you had to have that. You had to have something, a foreign policy that could be compatible with the Democratic Party's emerging politics in that moment, which were not really, it wasn't so much about the middle class, it was about anti-China-ism. And so like the way that you could move things on Capitol Hill, policy, is by attaching it to like the China boogeyman. And so there was a way of using the China threat in foreign policy to claim that you're using foreign policy to satisfy domestic politics. And so the China shock, quote unquote, in the American heartland, where manufacturing jobs went to China, like there was a kind of cynical or opportunistic move to use that as part of kind of like blame shifting our economic situation to China. And that was further validation of this framework of great power competition. So like the foreign policy for the middle class is like, we're going to say that our foreign policy responds to this problem that we blame on China. And it's also differentiating us from Trump at the same time. And it's serving the Democratic Party. So like, that's the sort of triangulation logic that leads Jake Sullivan to articulating a foreign policy for the middle class.